Hi, my name is Simon Bennett. I'm the OWASP ZAP founder and one of the project leads. And these are a series of training sessions I'm giving to the folks here at Stack.org, all about ZAP. And in the last session, I talked about automation and include things like the package scans. And I mentioned that it was possible to do authenticated scans with the package scans. But I didn't, and I kind of gave a summary of how to do it, but I didn't show how you actually did that. Now, I want to start talking about authentication, but authentication is quite a complex thing, both generally and with ZAP. But we've had quite a few questions in the ZAP user group about how to get authentication working with package scans. So I thought I would start with that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a very simple case. So simple case of authentication, but getting it working all the way through to working with the package scan. These videos are being published on YouTube, so if you find them useful, please like them and subscribe to them so you get alerted when any new ones come along. And hopefully you will see a set of windows come up. So one thing I will mention again is that we have got ZAPCon coming on March the 9th. So if you're watching this recording before then, please sign up for that and come along. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a very simple vulnerable web application, which just uses form-based authentication. It's very simple and it's something I wrote many years ago, probably started it before I started ZAP actually, called Bodgeit, and I've got that installed locally. So what I said last time is that it's always you should always do these things, set up, try everything out in the ZAP desktop. And actually had this morning we had somebody come onto the ZAP user group asking how to get authentication working completely in automation, and my immediate response was, you've got to use the desktop. Now, they actually pointed out that they couldn't use the desktop because they were running in Redshift, I think it was. So what will just mention is that if you go to the information about Docker, you will see we support something called WebSwing. So WebSwing actually allows you to access the ZAP desktop UI in your browser. So if you can't use the ZAP desktop, then you can use WebSwing. And we actually have a blog post about that as well, fairly recent one. So yeah, run ZAP without Java using Docker and WebSwing. What I will do is I'm going to start in the ZAP desktop, even though we want to end up with automation. What I'm going to do is I've got Bodgeit running on localhost, so I will just launch the browser so you can see what it looks like. There we've got Bodgeit. So it's running on localhost 8080/Bodgeit. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do some things wrong, or I'm going to do some things which won't work, knowing they won't work, but because this is what a lot of people actually end up doing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and run a ZAP scan against that without using automation. And what I'm going to do is I'm doing Docker run using this ZAP to Docker stable image, and I'm going to do the baseline. So the baseline will only do a 1-minute spider and then passive scanning, but it's exactly the same principles as, if you get it working with the baseline, it'll work with the full scan and it will be much quicker. So here I am, and I'm trying to try it against localhost 8080/Bodgeit. So I will kick that off, and these things will take a little while, but not too long in this case. And there we go. We've got a load of stuff dumped out on the screen. And this is actually the ZAP log. So if there are any problems with the package scans, we dump out the zap.log file so you can see if there are any potential any things flagged in there. And if I scroll up to the top, we will see somewhere, after a lot of messing around, here we have a stack trace, and we have ZAP failed to access localhost 8080/Bodgeit, which is a little bit surprising initially, maybe. Well, let's just double check that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run curl, and so curl localhost 8080/Bodgeit, and it works. So what's going on here? Well, the problem is when we run the ZAP package scans, then they run in Docker. So let's go back up to this Docker command, and instead of running the baseline, I'm going to run bash. And I want it interactive as well, so chuck an I in there. And right, so I'm now running in, I've got a bash shell in the ZAP to Docker stable image, and I will do a curl, and that's failing. So that is why the baseline scan was failing, because we couldn't access this site from the Docker image. And we get that quite often. People say, okay, this is broken, and the reason is they just weren't able to access the relevant URL from the Docker image. One of the standard things to do is, if you have this kind of problem, get a bash shell into your Docker image and see if you can access the site. In this case, we can't. So what can we do about that? Well, there are various options, but I'm going to just choose something fairly simple. So I'm just going to find out what other IP addresses this computer is listening on, and we'll see here we've got 192.168.0.40. So if I go here and replace localhost, then hopefully, yes. So we can still access Bodgeit store via that URL. This is good. What I can do now is I will go back to the Docker command. I will replace localhost with that IP address and kick it off. This is how I recommend you go about doing these things. So make sure you can see your application in the ZAP desktop, launch a browser, have a look at the site. We're going to look at it some more very shortly, but then try and actually just do something simple like the ZAP baseline with no authentication, no context or anything, and make sure that it actually works from the command line. Always do things one step at a time. Don't try and run before you can walk. So that should finish fairly soon. But what I'm going to do is, while that's running, I will just switch back to the browser, because what we want to do is we want to have an authenticated scan. And it so happens that with Bodgeit, by default, you don't get any users, so none that we tell you about. Actually, there you can then see, right, it's finished now. The scan has finished. You'll see actually we've gone up to we've gone above the Bodgeit level, so actually does spider the whole site, which might not be what you want in this case. But we've got a load of warnings and a load of passes as well. So the baseline worked, which is good. Let's go back to the Bodgeit store, and what we want to do is we want to register a new user. So I'm going to register test@test.com. And test123, I think there's a minimum length, and you've got to have at least one number in there, I think. And we'll register that. Now, we'll see actually, I'm now logged in, which is a little bit unusual. Usually sites will want you to log out and log in once you've registered. And we don't want to keep on having to register a user. We want to keep on reusing that user. So I'm going to log out, and notice we've got the log out option here. And now we've got the login, so we can log in and test at test.com and test123. Right, I can log in. And if you can't log into your site manually proxying through ZAP, then there's no way you're going to be able to set up authentication. You want to try it out in the browser first, proxying through ZAP. So let's go back to ZAP. So we've now captured all of these requests, and we've got something about the site now in sites tree. I'm now going to create a context, because as soon as you want to associate any properties with your application, you need a context. So right click, including context, and I'm going to create a new context. It's created one called Bodgeit. What that means is we now have something to add properties to. And you can see we're including everything under Bodgeit. We're not excluding anything at the moment. And we have things like authentication and session management. We can fill these out manually, but I don't recommend doing that. So I'm just going to OK that. And you'll see that all of these URLs now have a little target on. Don't know if you can see that or not. But what I want to do is I want to tell ZAP more about the application, because ZAP can't work things out on its own. We'd love to get to that stage, but we're quite a way off that yet. So one of the first things ZAP needs to know is about session handling. So I could have a look at all the requests and responses, but I do know that there is this params tab. So this will tell you about all the parameters that ZAP has seen. And we can see that ZAP has actually seen this J session ID. It's actually flagged it as a session as well. This is a pretty good indication that we've got cookie-based session handling. This is good. And if we actually go into Bodgeit, see session management, that is the default, cookie-based session management. We have HTTP authentication-based session management and script-based session management. And I'll probably show at least script-based session management at a future stage. But cookie-based session management is nice and straightforward, so we'll stick with that. What we now want to do is we want to find the login request. So it looks like Firefox has made a load of requests for me in the background. And we go down here and we'll see this post request. And here is where I'm specifying my username and password. What you do is you right-click that request and then you flag it as the context, and we'll see we've got Bodgeit form-based auth login request. So that's what I'm going to do. And it brings up this authentication tab. It's selected form-based authentication. You see we've got HTTP, NTLM, manual, script-based, JSON-based, but it's selected form-based for us. It's selected the URL to get first of all. Sorry, that's the URL to post, and this is the URL to get. We can change those, but we don't need to. And it's put in the post data as well. And then it's kind of identified, well, we have to specify two parameters, the username parameter, which it's got right, and the password parameter that it's got wrong. So I just need to select the password parameter. And if we scroll down, we get to something which is actually new in ZAP 2.10. So this is the verification strategy. And we've got various strategies. So every response, every request, every request or response, and polling. Now in this case, Bodgeit is a traditional web application, so we can just use every response. And then I could fill these details out, but I don't want to, because again, that's kind of, I'm more likely to get things wrong if I type stuff in. So I'm just going to OK that. And while I'm at it, I'm going to actually point out a little icon up here on the toolbar, which is forced user mode. And you'll see it's actually disabled. And you'll see I've got to configure at least one forced user for the context to enable. But I'm not going to do that yet, because what I want to do is I want to have a look at some of these requests. So what I want to do is I want to find out when we're logged out. So let's have a look at we'll get the login page here. And if we have a look at the request, we'll see that we're a guest user, and here we've got a login link. Now that's good. So we know the login link appears when we're logged out. So I'm going to highlight that, right-click it, and flag as context Bodgeit logged out indicator. And there it goes. It puts it in there with the right regex for me. So I don't have to go and type all this stuff in. This is good. But then what we need to do, we also need to tell ZAP about some users. So we go to users, and I'm going to add, so I'm just going to call it test, and it is test@test.com and test123. So add that, it's enabled by default. Then we've got this forced user option, but I've only got one user, so that one's set. So there we go, and you'll see here we've got this kind of open door icon here to show that ZAP knows that's the login request. And we've now told ZAP all about the authentication for this particular application. And you will see that this icon here, the force user mode, is now enableable. It's not enabled, but I can click on it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my browser, and you'll see I'm logged in. So I'm going to log out. And now if I click around, I stay logged out, which is not surprising. So what I'm going to do is go back to ZAP and show you forced user mode. Now, forced user mode isn't something we expect people to use all the time. It's very much a testing tool. So the fact that it's enabled means that ZAP thinks it knows enough information about authentication. If it was disabled like it was before, then ZAP doesn't know enough. So it's a good indication you've got to do something. So I'm going to enable that, go back to my browser and click somewhere. And you'll see I'm now logged in. So what force user mode does is ZAP will then have a look to see whether it thinks you're logged in based on the information you've given it, and then will actually log in for you if you're not logged in. I've now shown that I've correctly configured a ZAP, and if I actually manually log out and click somewhere, it logs me back in again. So that's great, but I don't want to use this for actual for automation. So I'm going to disable that. So what do I want to use for actually automating scans against ZAP? Well, if we go and right click, and I'll go to attack, and I'll select the active scan, you'll see because I've selected Bodgeit, it knows it's in the Bodgeit context, and I've now got an option to select a user. I'm not going to do an active scan in this case because it'll take a while, so I will just attack and do a spider, and you've got the same option here. So I've got this option, and I will select the spider, and I will stop the scan. And so ZAP has now spidered, and I'm hoping that it's spidered as that particular user. But I don't really know, do I? So one thing I can do is I can look at the messages and I can go through them and I can check each one, but that's not really ideal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and point my browser directly at ZAP. And I want to have a look at the API. And we go down to here to stats, and we've got these all site stats. And if I have a look at those, actually make this a little bit bigger, then you see we've got stats for each particular site. In this case, I want to have a look at the ones here, and we will see we've actually got some auth stats. So we've got auth state logged out 6, auth state unknown 112, auth state success 5. So we had 5 successes, but we've got a lot of unknowns. And that is because ZAP could tell things were logged out because they had logged out indicator, but I hadn't told ZAP about a logged in indicator. And I didn't need to for authentication to work, but it kind of helps when we talk about stats. So let's go back here and we'll have a look at the history again. And once I've gone to, so hopefully here I have logged in. Yep, so I've got user test at test.com, but I don't really want to have that as logged in indicator in case in the future I want to actually use some different users. So I'm just going to go down, and here we've got this logout link. If that appears, that's a pretty good indication that we are logged in. Yeah, it says logged out, but that's an indication we're logged in, if that makes sense. So I'm going to right click, flag as context, authentication logged in indicator. So now, even though I don't need to, I've got both a logged in indicator and a logged out indicator. Now, these are standard regexes. So if you have a set of, if your pages have different types of indications, then you can actually do some clever regexes and have, this or this or this. But ZAP won't help you with that. You've got to kind of work that out manually. And obviously we've got different options. So if you need to actually poll a URL, you can do that, but I'll show that in a future session. But I'm just going to OK that. And I'm going to go back and I'm actually going to clear these stats. So we have an action here for clearing the stats. I will run that, go back and have a look at all of the stats, and they should be empty now. And I will right click and attack and spider as that user, kick it off, and then refresh this. And we will see that we've got 111 logged in, and we've got 3 logged out and 9 unknown. So those 9 unknown, those are probably JavaScript files or things which which aren't HTML, don't have that that logged out link. That's really good because it shows that even though we're running things completely automated, we can actually see, we get a pretty good indication as long as our logged in indicators, logged in and logged out indicators are correct. We've got a fairly good feeling that we are actually doing authenticated scans. And this is kind of key, I think. You want to make sure that you are double checking that ZAP is doing what you think it's doing. So what I've done is I have got the authentication working in the ZAP desktop, which is all well and good. And as you can see, it's much easier to see what's going on and to play with things, but we want to do it in automation. So what I can do is I can export this context. So I'm going to export the context, and I'm going to overwrite because I've probably got one called Bodgeit there already, and I will save that. And if I had used any scripts, I would have to copy those as well. But in this case, I haven't had to. All I've had to do is set up the context. So gone back to my package scans directory, and I don't have anything in here. So what I want to do is I want to copy that context to my current working directory. So I've copied that context. So because I'm on Mac, it's on the user, so library application support, ZAP Contexts, Bodgeit.context, and you can actually have a look at that if you like. So you can see the name there, we can see the regex is all XML. We don't expect you to play with these things, but you can have a look at it if you like. So I've got the context locally, and so what I can do now is I can go back and run this package scan, and what a lot of people will do is -n Bodgeit and -u test. So I will just kick that off because that's the obvious thing to do, and you'll see it fails. So what I'll do is scroll up, and the error is a file-based option has been specified, but the directory /work, so /zap/work is not mounted. So this is actually something we cover in the documentation. So if I go to here and go to the documentation and Docker and go to the baseline scan, we will see that if you use the file parameters, you will need to mount the directory those files are in. This is because Docker doesn't have access to the file store by default. And the magic we need is here. Now that will work on Linux and Mac. It won't work on Windows because I'm using this working directory, but you can just put the full current working directory in. So I'm going to go back and inject it somewhere here and kick that off. And hopefully that will not fail as quickly. So just wait a couple of seconds, and there we go. And you will see that we actually have, so we've just got stuff under Bodgeit. We don't have anything under the root directory. So it's looking promising, but we still don't really know that we've done authenticated scans. Obviously, we've got the stats here. Now, one thing I talked about before is the scan hooks. So go back here and have a look at the scan hooks. So these are basically, this is a Python file that you specify, and then you have all these hooks, and you have access to the ZAP object, which allows you access to the API. The API is good because this is what I've got via the API. So I go back here because I don't actually want all of the site stats, because I can actually see an individual site stats. So what I want, I'll just test this out here because it's always best to do it this way. So I'll look at, so if I just specify one site, I can now see, great, I can get these stats out. But obviously these are ones from my local ZAP, not from the one that ran, but at least I can see that, I can just focus on these stats, and the stats I want all begin with stats.auth. So I am now going to create a new file. So I'm going to call it hook.py, and let's have another look at the documentation, because documentation is always good. And as I said, we've got this pre-shutdown hook, and that's good because we want to check these things just before ZAP shuts down, and we've got access to the ZAP object. And what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to make a great deal of use of it first. I'm just going to put in ZAP pre-shutdown. I've got the ZAP object. I'm just going to print out got here because, well, I'm kind of, I like doing these one step at a time just to make sure that I know what's going on. So what I'm going to do is run that again. And this time I'm going to do hook.py and kick that off again. And hopefully that won't take too long. But while that's going on, I can have a look here. And what I can do is try this out again. And I can put a key prefix. So I'm going to try the prefix stats.auth. That just gets me the auth stats. And we'll have a look here. And yep, my script is being run. This is good. So I'm going to edit that again. And what I now need is I'm just going to print out, I'm going to call, so ZAP, a link to the ZAP API. I then know we've got this stats component of the API, which is completely as per here. It's called stats. Then it's site stats. And for Python, we've actually tried to keep it Pythonic, and it's site underscore stats, not camel case. So the Python ones, we try and be nice, site underscore stats. Then I'm specifying the site, and I just want stats.auth. I will write that and quit. And then I will run this again. Just wait here and keep my fingers crossed. The demo gods are happy with me. Can you feel the tension in the air? And there we go. So we got here, and then we have dumped out these stats, and you can see that 121 were logged in, 4 were logged out, and 5 were unknown, and then we had 3 successes. So what we've now done is we have done an automated package scan of an application, and we've set up the context and the authentication via the ZAP desktop, and then we have exported that, and we've started using that, and we've also created a hook which will call the ZAP API to check that we really have done an authenticated scan. Because the authentication works in exactly the same way, I'd certainly hope that this would work. So this will work in exactly the same way for the ZAP full scan. So it'll just take a bit longer, and it wouldn't be runtime for me to demo it. But you can try that out for yourselves. Anyone who's listening right live, any questions about any of that?
Yeah, I have one question. So if I have an app that supports multiple forms of authentication, would I want to specify different context for each authentication approach?
I always recommend do the easiest one. What we're really testing here with ZAP is not the authentication. We're using authentication as a way to get authenticated. If you want, testing authentication is hard, and that's something which typically you do manually. So if you were doing manual pen testing, you would absolutely want to test each of the different ways of authenticating your application. But when we're doing automated scans like this, we're kind of using the automation so that we can get more access to the application and more access to its functionality. So I would always use the easiest form of authentication. And if you can run your application in a mode where you get a particularly easy option or no authentication, then do that. Just try and make life simple for yourself. That's my recommendation.
Right on. Thank you, Simon.
No problem. Great. Well, thank you very much. That is all for this time. And just a reminder, we've got ZAPCon coming up. ZAPCon coming on March the 9th, 2021, if that hasn't passed already for you. And do like this video and subscribe to the channel if you find them useful. Thank you very much.